Hello everyone, and welcome to the 183rd episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Titan from Megamind. As you saw in the intro, Titan has been requested to be featured in a video quite a lot, and while I aim to please, so here we are, discussing one of the more intriguing animation villains ever animated. A young man with some less than desirable traits that are amplified by his acquisition of superpowers that transform him into a monster in a man-child's body. Now interestingly enough, I have a more personal relationship with this film. You see, if you couldn't tell already, I'm actually bald, and there's been many times over the course of my life where people have charmingly referred to me as Megamind, which is something I'm definitely not bitter about and thoroughly enjoy. Is it really that big?
Oh, my giant blue head!
Anyway, without further ado, let's begin. Though Hal Stewart is still Hal Stewart after he's been given superpowers by Megamind, there's an evolution in character that takes place following his transformation that almost turns him into a different person. Almost is the key word here though, as it's more so the case that becoming Titan made it so Hal's more negative traits became much more apparent. Hal before his transformation was an overweight and awkward nerd, one whose personality we only really got to see through his repeated attempts at gaining Roxanne's affections. And while there is a moment where Hal hints to us that he's kind of a creep when he tells her he'll be watching her like a dingo watches a baby, he mostly seems like an inept love-struck fool who doesn't know the first thing about speaking to women. To his credit, Hal actually seems to understand to a certain degree that he's the one at fault when it comes to wooing Roxy, as he does have a breakdown after she rejects his invitation to party at his house, stating that he's stupid for thinking girls like bouncy houses, because girls like clowns of course, which is something you wouldn't expect from what sort of person Hal is often referred to as a nice guy. But what is a nice guy, and why is Hal often considered one? Well, the term can mean many things, but in this context, a nice guy is used to negatively refer to a man who is self-absorbed, self-pitying, and generally unpleasant to be around, who believes that they are just a nice person that everyone else is out to get. And by virtue of simply treating women nicely, they believe they are somehow owed their affections due to said niceness. But in reality, the nice guy is only superficially nice, as it's often the case that the nice guy will show their true ugly self once they're rejected by a woman, blaming them for their perceived promiscuity, stupidity, or malice, and lashing out at them in place of acceptance or introspection, so they might learn why they rejected them, not why they're obviously harlots for refusing their advances. Now, how someone develops into a nice guy is central to understanding Hal, and typically one develops nice guy traits once they develop an interest in the opposite sex, which is to say in adolescence or during middle or high school. So there is a logical path to follow when trying to imagine what Hal's early life was like and how he developed into the man we see in the film, but we're actually given a couple indicators that allow us to make some more solid inferences about what Hal's childhood and adolescence was like. In a scene where Megamind is training Hal, Hal gives himself a wedgie and remarks that it doesn't even hurt, which indicates to us that Hal has experienced the more painful variety of wedgie before, which confirms for us something that we could have only guessed, that Hal was likely bullied when he was younger. Now, along with this notion, when you take into account a specific component of Hal's personality, that being his use of gifts and imagined connections to try to gain the affections of Roxanne, I think we have a good idea of who Hal was when he was in shul. Hal Stewart was the awkward and chubby kid who just wanted to fit in, a kid who wasn't content to be a nerd who hung out with other nerds, but one that was always trying to gain the recognition of the popular kids, a kid who would have tried to buddy up to the captain of the football team with humor, praise, and offers of bouncy houses and dip back at his house, only to be dunked headfirst into a toilet with his underwear wrapped around his head in return. Now, kids and teenagers can be cruel, and there's nothing wrong with trying to fit in with certain groups, and it's certainly not Hal's fault that he was shunned and rejected by these people. But unfortunately, trying to force your way into people's lives who choose to associate with certain types of people's good graces typically never works. And while we can't fault Hal for trying, we can fault him for the way he handled these situations, as that's what it means to be a nice guy. Rather than reflecting on why the people he so desperately wanted to gain recognition from refused to do so, or better yet, realizing that people who would treat a man so poorly for simply trying to be friends with them aren't worth his time, Hal likely adopted the attitude that he was just a nice guy trying to fit in. But because he didn't have the looks, athletics, or charisma that comes naturally to these people, Hal believed he was rejected due to the absence of these qualities within him, along with the fact that he was just simply too nice and inherently better than them. A boy who perceived that the people he was trying to buddy up to were just cruel and ignorant losers who couldn't see the great person right in front of them, because, well, nice guys always finish last. What's interesting to note though, is that as I stated earlier, Hal's nice guy traits were bubbling just beneath the surface prior to his attainment of superpowers. And the main point of discussing all these things is to take into account the fact that Hal wants a lot of things from people, specifically here a relationship with Roxanne, but he doesn't really want to put in the effort required to build those things with people. Either be content with who you are, or change yourself so you can try and get what you're looking for out of life. But if you don't want to change, and you still feel like you're entitled to what others are looking for should you change, then you can't expect expect to get the results you're looking for. As if you want to attract a partner, go figure, you need to make yourself attractive. Now, being attractive isn't as simple as practicing good hygiene, putting on muscle, and wearing flashy clothes, as it's not necessarily Hal's appearance that's detrimental to his aspirations to enter into a relationship with Roxanne, but his personality. Very few women are going to be charmed by a superficial, socially inept, and self-centered man who believes that impressing a woman with flashy gifts and promises of a better world should she only abandon all other prospects and tie herself to him, as that's typically the MO of the nice guy when they're trying to convince a woman to be with them, telling them in so many ways that life with them would be better than life as it is, or with someone else, by exploiting whatever snippets of negative information they receive from their target to spin it in their favor. Like if they complain about the men in their lives treating them badly in even the smallest way, the nice guy will try to woo them by telling them that they would never treat them that way, because they would treat them like a queen. Just like when Hal tells Roxanne that if he were Metro Man, she wouldn't be getting kidnapped all the time, because he'd be watching her like a dingo watches a baby. Now, as off-putting as nice guys are, and as dangerous as they can potentially be, in Hal's case, it seems that his Roxanne obsession would have eventually led him down the path of decrying her as a tramp, and perhaps quitting his job, or getting himself fired for untoward behavior once she entered into a relationship with someone else. Which is not ideal, nor acceptable, but that's relatively harmless when compared to what happens when Hal becomes Titan. Roxanne remarks at one point in the film that Hal was the worst person that Megamind could have made into a hero, and the aforementioned nice guy traits that Hal embodies have a lot to do with this. If we look at a traditional superhero, like Metro Man, and compare him to Hal, as Hal in many ways is the anti-Metro Man, it's easy to see why. Metro Man was raised to be disciplined, compassionate, and ever mindful of justice and the greater good. And while Metro Man is narcissistic and egotistical, that ego actually helped facilitate his evolution into a superhero. As in truth, the moral ideals of a superhero may not have been a priority for the young Metro Man had he not been fed mountains of praise that steered him towards pleasing others, so they would stroke his ego. And while becoming the savior of your city for the praise and glory that it brings aren't the best intentions to have, at least he's actually the savior of his city, who's doing far more good than he is bad, even if he was shoehorned into the position and felt like he didn't have a choice in doing so. Hal, on the other hand, never had a shred of positive social or lifestyle choices instilled within him. And when we're given our first glimpse into Hal's apartment, it becomes readily apparent that he's lazy, undisciplined, and selfish. A man who's content to live in filth and eat junk food for every meal, that likely spends all of his time glued to a computer or TV screen. A man that all the girls should feel lucky to have in their lives. And to make matters worse, as his saga as Titan unfolds, we also learn that Hal isn't too bright either, which only amplifies the severity of his rampage through atrocity. So what do you get when you grant the powers of a superhero to someone like Hal? Why, an overgrown man-child with the powers of a god, who's liable to use those powers for his own benefit, to the detriment of everyone around him. And that's exactly what we get. During Hal's training, we're shown some of what's to come as he clumsily rushes through every trial he's faced with using brute force that's accentuated by cruel laughter. But once Megamind makes the mistake of telling Hal that all he needs to do to get the girl of his dreams is to save her, we get our first real example of Hal being a nice guy. Hal flies up to Roxanne's apartment with an overly macho charisma to try and finally get her to fall in love with him, offering her a cart of flowers before he essentially kidnaps her and flings her haphazardly about the city so he can save her, in the process nearly killing her several times as that clumsy lack of discipline he has guides his every move. Here we get some of the nice guy propensity to speak for someone through the preconceived ideas they've built in their heads about what women like, or what they believe they should like, with Hal stating that flying with him must be very thrilling for Roxanne, and that she's so lucky to have a great hero around her to save her from himself. All of this screams nice guy, as it would seem that Hal has gotten all his knowledge on how to get girls from comic books and campy superhero flicks, believing that the only reason girls are attracted to men like Metro Man, and not Hal, is because they have certain traits and characteristics that automatically cause women to gravitate towards them. And that can certainly be the case when you're dealing with more superficial women, but they're the exception, not the rule. In Hal's mind though, they are the rule, which is exemplified by his statement that there's nothing keeping Roxanne and himself apart now that he's a superhero. And when Roxanne rejects the notion that they're an item now, Hal is flabbergasted, as his idea of what it means to attract a woman is so warped that he wholeheartedly believed that simply having powers would be enough to guarantee that Roxanne would be his. What ensues following his rejection is a severe amplification of the negative reaction you'd expect a non-super infused nice guy to have upon being rejected by the apple of his eye. Hal, as anyone might have expected, has reasoned that being a superhero is far too much work, and being a villain is far more rewarding for much less work. So he's taken to stealing everything he's ever wanted and formulating a plan to team up with Megamind so he can rule the city, as the only point of him becoming a hero, according to Hal, was so he could get the girl. So he might as well use his powers to get what he wants, now that he wasn't able to get what he wanted by being a hero. Things were probably only going to get worse had Megamind not goaded him into fighting him by revealing that he created him and was the man Roxanne was dating. But once he does, Hal becomes a menace far worse than anything Megamind could have ever dreamed of being, with buildings set ablaze or destroyed, cars exploded, and who knows how many lives lost as he rampaged through the city to claim it for himself. All because this oh-so-nice guy wasn't able to get his idealized version of a woman he really knew nothing about. Which is made all the more ironic by the fact that Hal blames Roxanne for never getting to know the real him when she's attempting to reason with him, and even more so when Hal accuses Roxanne of living in a fantasy land, telling her that this is the real world, and imploring her that she needs to wake up, a lack of introspection that's central to the nice guy pathology. So upon becoming Titan, without a doubt, Hal became an evil man. But was Hal always going to turn out evil, even if he wasn't given superpowers? Probably not. It's always possible that a nice guy's negative traits will translate into violent action when they don't get their way. But Hal seems like the kind of guy who was going to eternally shoot for the stars using a rocket ship made of wood. And every time he crashed back to Earth, he probably would have just returned to his hovel to decry everyone around him as losers who just don't get it. Power can bring out the worst in people, and when someone is already a less than desirable person, well, it should come as no surprise when they start using their newfound powers to live out every cruel fantasy they've ever had. Hal likely never had anyone around to teach him what it meant to be a good person, especially one that women naturally gravitate towards. As I said earlier, I imagine Hal only had his games, comic books, and movies to teach him what women wanted. A man who became wholly ignorant to what social and emotional intelligence actually is, because he was definitely stuck in his own fantasy land. As when it comes down to it, that's what a nice guy is. Someone who's ignorant to the ways of the world, who is so self-absorbed that they can't see beyond their own desires and self-importance to recognize that they are only an echo of what a person who cultivates positive relationships are supposed to be. And it's this ignorance that leads them to blaming the world for every fault they have and projecting it onto others. Because they're just so nice, and everyone else is just a loser. So it's poor role models, or an absence of them, and poor treatment by one's peers in combination with high expectations, delusions of grandeur, and unabashed selfishness that creates a man like Hal Stewart, which can then birth a monster like Titan. And while there are many factors that went into making Hal who he is, and then in making Hal into Titan, ultimately, the only one responsible for the atrocities he committed as Titan is Hal, as though we can look to what influenced people into becoming who they are as an explanation for why they are who they are. Everyone's choices are ultimately their own, and unfortunately for this supervillainous nice guy, he chose evil.
Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Titan? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, and anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.